evening, everyone. How are you? Hope you're doing well. It is Sunday. Happy Father's Day to anyone who celebrates. Yeah. I don't think I have any announcements at the moment. We did finish the main game of Little Nightmares. We're working on the DLC now, so if you want to watch me play through some of the DLC, join me on Thursday as we continue through our Little Nightmares playthrough. And we will probably start a different game after that. Yeah. And so we can get back to M.R. James with the next short story. The story of a disappearance and an appearance. The letters which I now publish were sent to me recently by a person who knows me to be interested in ghost stories. There is no doubt about their authenticity. The paper on which they are written, the ink, and the whole external aspect put their date beyond the reach of question. The only point which they do not make clear is the identity of the writer. He signs with initials only, and as none of the envelopes of the letters are preserved, the surname of his correspondent, obviously a married brother, is as obscure as his own. No further preliminary explanation is needed, I think. Luckily, the first letter supplies all that could be expected. Letter 1. Great Chris Hall, December 22nd, 1837. My dear Robert, it is with great regret for the enjoyment I am losing and for a reason which you will deplore equally with myself that I write to inform you that I am unable to join your circle for this Christmas, but you will agree with me that it is unavoidable when I say that I have within these few hours received a letter from Mrs. Hunt at B to the effect that our Uncle Henry has suddenly and mysteriously disappeared, and begging me to go down there immediately and join the search that is being made for him. Little as I, or you either, I think, have ever seen of Uncle, I naturally feel that this is not a request that can be regarded lightly, and accordingly I propose to go to B by this afternoon's mail, reaching it late in the evening. I shall not go to the rectory, but put up at the King's Head, into which you may address letters. I enclose a small draft, which you will please make use of for the benefit of the young people. I shall write you daily, supposing me to be detained more than a single day, what goes on, and you may be sure, should the business be cleared up in time to permit of my coming to the manor after all, I shall present myself. I have but a few minutes at my disposal. With cordial greetings to you all, and many regrets, believe me, your affectionate bro, W.R. Letter 2. King's Head, December 23rd, 1837. My dear Robert, in the first place, there is as yet no news of Uncle H, and I think you may finally dismiss any idea, I won't say hope, that I might after all turn up for Xmas. However, my thoughts will be with you, and you have my best wishes for a really festive day. Mind that none of my nephews or nieces expend any fraction of their guineas on presents for me. Since I got here, I have been blaming myself for taking this affair of Uncle H too easily. From what people here say, I gather that there is very little hope that he can still be alive, but whether it is accident or design that carried him off, I cannot judge. The facts are these. On Friday the 19th, he went as usual shortly before 5 o'clock to read evening prayers at the church, and when they were over, the clerk brought him a message, in response to which he set off to pay a visit to a sick person at an outlying cottage the better part of 2 miles away. He paid the visit and started on his return journey at about 6:30. This is the last that is known of him. The people here are very much grieved at his loss. He had been here many years, as you know, and though, as you also know, he was not the most genial of men, and had more than a little of the martinet in his composition, he seems to have been active in good works and unsparing of trouble to himself. Poor Mrs. Hunt, who had been his housekeeper ever since she left Woodley, is quite overcome. It seems like the end of the world to her. I'm glad I did not entertain the idea of taking quarters at the rectory, and I have declined several kindly offers of hospitality from people in the place, preferring as I do to be independent and finding myself very comfortable here. You will, of course, wish to know what has been done in the way of inquiry and search. First, nothing was to be expected from investigation at the rectory, and to be brief, nothing has transpired. I asked Mrs. Hunt, as others had done before, whether there was either any unfavorable symptom in her master, such as might portend a sudden stroke or attack of illness, or whether he had ever had reason to apprehend any such thing, but both she and also his medical man were clear that this was not the case. He was quite in his usual health. In the second place, naturally, ponds and streams have been dragged, and fields in the neighborhood which he is known to have visited last have been searched without result. I have myself talked to the parish clerk, and, more important, have been to the house where he paid his visit. There can be no question of any foul play on these people's parts. The one man in the house is ill in bed and very weak. The wife and the children, of course, could do nothing themselves, nor is there the shadow of probability that they or any of them should have agreed to decoy poor Uncle H. out in order that he might be attacked on the way back. They had told what they knew to several other inquirers already, but the woman repeated it to me. The rector was looking just as usual. He wasn't very long with the sick man. He ain't, she said, like some what has a gift in prayer, but there, if we was all that way, however, would the chapel people get their living. He left some money when he went away, and one of the children saw him cross the stile into the next field. He was dressed as he always was, wore his bands. I gather he is nearly the last man remaining who does so, at any rate in this district. You see, I am putting down everything. The fact is that I have nothing else to do, having brought no business papers with me, and moreover, it serves to clear my own mind, and may suggest points which have been overlooked. So, I shall continue to write all that passes, even to conversations if need be. You may read or not as you please, but pray keep the letters. I have another reason for writing so fully, but it is not a very tangible one. You may ask if I have myself made any search in the fields near the cottage. Something a good deal has been done by others, as mentioned, but I hope to go over the ground tomorrow. Bow Street has now been informed, and will send down by tonight's coach, but I do not think they will make much of the job. There is no snow, which might have helped us. The fields are all grass. Of course, I was on the Kiwiwe, the how to live, how it lives, for any indication today, both going and returning. But there was a thick mist on the way back, and I was not in trim for wandering about unknown pastures, especially on an evening when bushes looked like men, and a cow lowing in the distance might have been the last trump. I assure you, if Uncle Henry had stepped out from among the trees in a little copse which borders the path at one place, carrying his head under his arms, I should have been very little more uncomfortable than I was. To tell you the truth, I was rather expecting something of the kind, but I must drop my pen for the moment. Mr. Lucas, the curate, is announced. Later. Mr. Lucas has been and gone, and there is not much beyond the decencies of ordinary sentiment to be got from him. I can see that he has given up any idea that the rector can be alive, and that, so far as he can be, he is truly sorry. I can also discern that even in a more emotional person than Mr. Lucas, Uncle Henry was not likely to inspire strong attachment. Besides Mr. Lucas, I have had another visitor, in the shape of my Boniface, mine host of the King's Head, who came to see whether I had everything I wished, and who really requires the pen of a Boz to do him justice. He was very solemn and weighty at first. "Well, sir," he said, "I suppose we must bow our head beneath the blow, as my poor wife used to say. So far as I can gather, there's been neither hide nor yet heir of our late respected incumbent scented out as yet, not that he was what the Scripture terms an airy man in any sense of the word." I said as well as I could that I supposed not, but could not help adding that I had heard he was sometimes a little difficult to deal with. Mr. Bowman looked at me sharply for a moment, and then passed in a flash from solemn sympathy to impassioned declamation. "When I think," he said, "of the language that man see fit to employ to me here in this parlour over no more a matter than a cask of beer, such a thing as I told him might happen any day of the week to a man with a family, though, as it turned out, he was quite under a mistake, and that I knew at the time, only I was that shocked to hear him, I couldn't lay my tongue to the right expression." He stopped abruptly and eyed me with some embarrassment. I only said, "Dear me, I'm sorry to hear you had any little differences. I suppose my uncle will be a good deal missed in the parish?" Mr. Bowman drew a long breath. "Ah, yes," he said. "Your uncle. You'll understand me when I say that for the moment it has slipped my remembrance that he was a relative, and natural enough, I must say, as it should, for as to you bearing any resemblance to him, the notion of any such thing is clean ridiculous. All the same, had I bore it in my mind, you'd be among the first to feel, I'm sure, as I should have abstained my lips, or rather, I should not have abstained my lips with no such reflections." I assured him that I quite understood, and was going to have asked him some further questions, but he was called away to see after some business. By the way, you need not take it into your head that he has anything to fear from the inquiry into poor Uncle Henry's disappearance, though, no doubt, in the watches of the night it will occur to him that I think he has, and I may expect explanations tomorrow. I must close this letter. It has to go by the late coach. Letter 3. December 25th, 1837. My dear Robert, this is a curious letter to be writing on Christmas Day, and yet, after all, there is nothing much in it. Or there may be. You shall be the judge. At least nothing decisive. The Bow Street men practically say that they have no clue. The length of time and the weather conditions have made all tracks so faint as to be quite useless. Nothing that belonged to the dead man, I'm afraid no other word will do, has been picked up. As I expected, Mr. Bowman was uneasy in his mind this morning. Quite early I heard him holding forth in a very distinct voice, purposely so, I thought, to the Bow Street officers in the bar, as to the loss that the town had sustained in their rector, and as to the necessity of leaving no stone unturned. He was very great on his phrase, in order to come at the truth. I suspect him of being an orator of repute at convivial meetings. When I was at breakfast, he came to wait on me, and took an opportunity when handing a muffin to say in a low tone, "I hope, sir, you recognize as my feelings towards your relative is not actuated by any taint of what you may call malignity. You can leave the room, Eliza. I'll see the gentleman, as all he requires, with my own hands. I ask your pardon, sir, but you must be well aware a man is not always master of himself, and when that man has been hurt in his mind by the application of expressions which I will go so far as to say had not ought to have been made use of, his voice was rising all this time, and his face growing redder. No, sir, and here, if you will permit of it, I should like to explain to you in a very few words the exact state of the bone of contention. This cask, I might more truly call it a firkin, of beer." I felt it was time to interpose, and said that I did not see that it would help us very much to go into that matter in detail. Mr. Bowman acquiesced, and resumed more calmly. "Well, sir, I bow to your ruling, and as you say, be that here or be it there, it don't contribute a great deal, perhaps, to the present question. All I wish you to understand is that I am as prepared as you are yourself to lend every hand to the business we have afore us, and as I took the opportunity to say as much to the officers not 3/4 of an hour ago, to leave no stone unturned as may throw even a spark of light on this painful matter." In fact, Mr. Bowman did accompany us on our exploration, but though I am sure his genuine wish was to be helpful, I am afraid he did not contribute to the serious side of it. He appeared to be under the impression that we were likely to meet either Uncle Henry or the person responsible for his disappearance walking about the fields, and did a great deal of shading his eyes with his hands and calling our attention by pointing with his stick to distant cattle and laborers. He held several long conversations with old women whom we met, and was very strict and severe in his manner, but on each occasion returned to our party, saying, "Well, I find she don't seem to have no connection with this sad affair. I think you may take it from me, sir, as there's little or no light to be looked for from that quarter, not without she's keeping something back intentional." We gained no appreciable result, as I told you at starting. The Bow Street men have left the town, whether for London or not I am not sure. This evening I had a company in the shape of a bagman, a smartish fellow. He knew what was going forward, but though he had been on the roads for some days about here, he had nothing to tell of suspicious characters, tramps, wandering sailors, or merchants. He was very full of a capital Punch and Judy show he had seen this same day at W, and asked if it had been here yet, and advised me by no means to miss it if it does come. The best Punch and the best Toby dog, he said, he'd ever come across. And Toby dogs, you know, are the last new thing in the shows. I've only seen one myself, but before long all the men will have them. Now, why, you will want to know, do I trouble to write all this to you? I'm obliged to do it because it has something to do with another absurd trifle, as you will inevitably say, which, in my present state of rather unquiet fancy, nothing more perhaps, I have to put down. It is a dream, sir, which I am going to record, and I must say it is one of the oddest I have had. Is there anything in it beyond what the bagman's talk and Uncle Henry's disappearance could have suggested? You, I repeat, shall judge. I am not in a sufficiently cool and judicial frame to do so. It began with what I can only describe as a pulling aside of curtains, and I found myself seated in a place I don't know whether indoors or out. There were people, only a few on either side of me, but I did not recognize them or indeed think much about them. They never spoke, but so far as I remember were all grave and pale-faced and looked fixedly before them. Facing me, there was a Punch and Judy show, perhaps rather larger than the ordinary ones, painted with black figures on a reddish-yellow ground behind it, and on each side was only darkness, but in front there was a sufficiency of light. I was strung up to a high degree of expectation, and listened every moment to hear the panpipes and the root-toot-toot. Instead of that, there came suddenly an enormous, I can use no other word, an enormous single toll of a bell, I don't know from how far off, somewhere behind. The little curtain flew up, and the drama began. I believe someone once tried to rewrite Punch as a serious tragedy, but whoever he may have been, this performance would have suited him exactly. There was something satanic about the hero. He varied his method of attack. For some of his victims he lay in wait, and to see his horrible face, it was a yellowish white, I may remark, peering round the wings, made me think of the vampire in Fuseli's foul sketch. To others he was polite and carneying, particularly to the unfortunate alien who can only say shalabala, though what Punch said I could never catch. But with all of them I came to dread the moment of death, the crack of the stick on their skulls, which in the ordinary way delights me, had here a crushing sound, as if the bone was giving way, and the victims quivered and kicked as they lay. The baby... It sounds more ridiculous as I go on. The baby, I am sure, was alive. Punch wrung its neck, and if the choke or squeak which it gave were not real, I know nothing of reality. The stage got perceptibly darker as each crime was consummated, and at last there was one murder which was done quite in the dark, so that I could see nothing of the victim, and took some time to effect. It was accompanied by hard breathing and horrid muffled sounds, and after it Punch came and sat on the footboard and fanned himself, and looked at his shoes, which were bloody, and hung his head on one side, and snickered in so deadly a fashion that I saw some of those beside me cover their faces, and I would gladly have done the same, but in the meantime the scene behind Punch was clearing, and showed not the usual house front, but something more ambitious. A grove of trees, and the gentle slope of a hill, with a very natural, in fact, I should say, a real moon shining on it. Over this there rose slowly an object which I soon perceived to be a human figure with something peculiar about the head. What I was unable at first to see. It did not stand on its feet, but began creeping or dragging itself across the middle distance toward Punch, who still sat back to it, and by this time I may remark, though it did not occur to me at the moment, that all pretense of this being a puppet show had vanished. Punch was still Punch, it is true, but like the others, was in some sense a live creature, and both moved themselves at their own will. When I next glanced at him, he was sitting in malignant reflection, but in another instant something seemed to attract his attention, and he first sat up sharply and then turned round and evidently caught sight of the person that was approaching to him, and was in fact now very near. Then, indeed, did he show unmistakable signs of terror. Catching up his stick, he rushed towards the woods, only just eluding the arm of his pursuer, which was suddenly flung out to intercept him. It was with a revulsion which I cannot easily express that I now saw more or less clearly what this pursuer was like. He was a sturdy figure, clad in black, and as I thought wearing bands. His head was covered with a whitish bag. The chase which now began lasted I do not know how long, now among the trees, now along the slope of the field, sometimes both figures disappearing wholly for a few seconds, and only some uncertain sounds letting one know that they were still afoot. At length there came a moment when Punch, evidently exhausted, staggered in from the left and threw himself down among the trees. His pursuer was not long after him and came looking uncertainly from side to side. Then, catching sight of the figure on the ground, he too threw himself down. His back was turned to the audience. With a swift motion twitched the covering from his head and thrust his face into that of Punch. Everything on the instant grew dark. There was one long, loud, shuddering scream, and I awoke to find myself looking straight into the face of what in all the world do you think but a large owl, which was seated on my window-sill immediately opposite my bed-foot, holding up its wings like two shrouded arms. I caught the fierce glance of its yellow eyes, and then it was gone. I heard the single enormous bell again, very likely, as you are saying to yourself, the church clock, but I do not think so. And then I was broad awake. All this, I may say, happened within the last half hour. There was no probability of my getting to sleep again, so I got up, put on clothes enough to keep me warm, and am writing this rigmarole in the first hours of Christmas Day. Have I left out anything? Yes, there was no Toby dog, and the names over the front of the Punch and Judy booth were Kidman and Gallop, which were certainly not what the bagman told me to look out for. By this time I feel a little more as if I could sleep, so this shall be sealed and wafered. Letter 4, December 26th, 1837. My dear Robert, all is over. The body has been found. I do not make excuses for not having sent off my news by last night's mail, for the simple reason that I was incapable of putting pen to paper. The events that attended the discovery bewildered me so completely that I needed what I could get of a night's rest to enable me to face the situation at all. Now I can give you my journal of the day, certainly the strangest Christmas Day that ever I spent or am likely to spend. The first incident was not serious. Mr. Bowman had, I think, been keeping Christmas Eve and was a little inclined to be captious. At least he was not on foot very early, and to judge from what I could hear, neither men nor maids could do anything to please him. The latter were certainly reduced to tears, nor am I sure that Mr. Bowman succeeded in preserving a manly composure. At any rate, when I came downstairs, it was in a broken voice that he wished me the compliments of the season, and a little later on, when he paid his visit of ceremony at breakfast, he was far from cheerful, even Byronic, I might also say, in his outlook on life. "Well, I don't know," he said, "if you think with me, sir, but every Christmas as comes round, the world seems a hollerer thing to me. I take an example now from what lays under my own eye. There's my servant Eliza, been with me now for going on 15 years. I thought I could have placed my confidence on Eliza, but yet this very morning, Christmas morning too, of all the blessed days in the year, with the bells a-ringing and all like that, I say this very morning, had it not been for Providence watching over us all, that girl would have put, indeed I may go so far as to say, I'd put the cheese on your breakfast table." He saw I was about to speak and waved his hand at me. "That's all very well for you to say, yes, Mr. Bowman, but you took away the cheese and locked it up in the cupboard, which I did, and I have the key here, or if not the actual key, one very much about the same size.
That's true enough, sir, but what do you think is the effect of that action on me? Why, it's no exaggeration for me to say that the ground is cut from under my feet, and when I said as much to Eliza, not nasty, mind you, but just firm-like, what was my return? Oh, she says, well, she says, there wasn't no bones broke, I suppose. Well, sir, it hurt me, that's all I can say. It hurt me, and I don't like to think of it now.
There was an ominous pause here in which I ventured to say something like, yes, very trying, and then asked at what hour the church service was to be.
11 o'clock,
Mr. Bowman said with a heavy sigh.
You won't have no such discourse from poor Mr. Lucas as what you would have done from our late rector. Him and me may have had our little differences, and did do. More's a pity.
I could see that a powerful effort was needed to keep him off the vexed question of the cask of beer, but he made it.
I will say this. That's a better preacher, nor yet one to stand fasted by his rights, or what he considered to be his rights. However, that's not the question now. I, for one, never said under. Some might say, was he an eloquent man, and to that my answer would be, well, there you've a better right perhaps to speak of your own uncle than what I have. Others might ask, did he keep a hold of his congregation, and there again I should reply, it depends. But as I say, yes, Eliza, my girl, I'm coming. 11 o'clock, sir, and you inquire for the King's Head pew.
I believe Eliza had been very near the door, and shall consider it in my veil. The next episode was church. I felt Mr. Lucas had a difficult task in doing justice to the Christmas sentiments, and also to the feeling of disquiet and regret which, whatever Mr. Bowen might say, was clearly prevalent. I do not think he rose to the occasion. I was uncomfortable. The organ wolved, you know what I mean. The wind died, twice in the Christmas hymn, and the tenor bell, I suppose owing to some negligence on the part of the ringers, kept sounding faintly about once in a minute during the sermon. The clerk sent up a man to see to it, but he seemed unable to do much. I was glad when it was over. There was an odd incident, too, before the service. I went in rather early, and came upon 2 men carrying the parish bier back to its place under the tower. From what I overheard them saying, it appeared that it had been put out by mistake by someone who was not there. I also saw the clerk busy folding up a moth-eaten velvet pall, not a sight for Christmas Day. I dined soon after this, and then, feeling disinclined to go out, took my seat by the fire in the parlour with the last number of Pickwick, which I had been saving up for some days. I thought I could be sure of keeping awake over this, but it turned out I was as bad as our friend Smith. I suppose it was 2:30 when I was roused by a piercing whistle, and laughing and talking voices outside in the marketplace. It was a Punch and Judy. I had no doubt the one that my bagman had seen at W. I was half delighted, half not, the latter because my unpleasant dream came back to me vividly, but anyhow, I determined to see it through, and I sent Eliza out with a crown piece to the performers and a request that they would face my window if they could manage it. The show was a very smart new one. The names of the proprietors, I need hardly tell you, were Italian, Foresta and Calpighi. The Toby dog was there, as I had been led to expect. All B turned out, but did not obstruct my view, for I was at the large first-floor window and not 10 yards away. The play began on the stroke of 2:45 by the church clock. Certainly it was very good, and I was soon relieved to find that the disgust my dream had given me for Punch's onslaughts on his ill-starred visitors was only transient. I laughed at the demise of the turncock, the foreigner, the beadle, and even the baby. The only drawback was the Toby dog's developing a tendency to howl in the wrong place. Something had occurred, I suppose, to upset him, and something considerable, for I forget exactly at what point he gave a most lamentable cry, leaped off the footboard, and shot away across the marketplace and down a side street. There was a stage wait, but only a brief one. I suppose the men decided that it was no good going after him, and that he was likely to turn up again at night. We went on. Punch dealt faithfully with Judy, and in fact with all comers, and then came the moment when the gallows was erected and the great scene with Mr. Ketch was to be enacted. It was now that something happened of which I can certainly not yet see the import fully. You have witnessed an execution, and know what the criminal's head looks like with the cap on. If you are like me, you never wish to think of it again, and I do not willingly remind you of it. It was just such a head as that I, from my somewhat higher post saw in the inside of the show box, but at first the audience did not see it. I expected it to emerge into their view, but instead of that there slowly rose for a few seconds an uncovered face, with an expression of terror upon it, of which I have never imagined the like. It seemed as if the man, whoever he was being forcibly lifted, with his arms somehow pinioned or held back towards the little gibbet on the stage. I could just see the night-capped head behind him. Then there was a cry and a crash. The whole show-box fell over backwards. Kicking legs were seen among the ruins, and then two figures, as some said, I can only answer for one, were visible, running at top speed across the square and disappearing in a lane which leads to the fields. Well, of course, everybody gave chase. I followed, but the pace was killing, and very few in, literally, at the death. It happened in a chalk pit. The man went over the edge quite blindly and broke his neck. They searched everywhere for the other until it occurred to me to ask whether he had ever left the marketplace. At first, everyone was sure that he had, but when we came to look, he was there, under the show box, dead too. But in the chalk pit, it was that poor Uncle Henry's body was found, with a sack over the head, the throat horribly mangled. It was a peaked corner of the sack sticking out of the soil that attracted attention. I cannot bring myself to write in greater detail. I forgot to mention that the men's real names were Kidman and Gallup. I feel sure I have heard them, but no one here seems to know anything about them. I am coming to you as soon as I can after the funeral. I must tell you when we meet what I think of it all. Two doctors. It is a very common thing in my experience to find papers shut up in old books, but one of the rarest things to come across any such that are at all interesting. Still, it does happen, and one should never destroy them unlooked at. Now, it was a practice of mine before the war occasionally to buy old ledgers of which the paper was good, and which possessed a good many blank leaves, and to extract these and use them for my own notes and writings. One such I purchased for a small sum in 1911. It was tightly clasped, and its boards were warped by having for years been obliged to embrace a number of extraneous sheets. 3/4 of this inserted matter had lost all vestige of importance for any living human being. One bundle had not. That it belonged to a lawyer is certain, but it is endorsed "the strangest case I have yet met," and bears initials and an address in Gray's Inn. It is only materials for a case, and consists of statements by possible witnesses. The man who would have been the defendant or prisoner seems never to have appeared. The dossier is not complete, but such as it is, it furnishes a riddle in which the supernatural appears to play a part. You must see what you can make of it. The following is the setting, and the tale as I elicit it. Dr. Abel was walking in his garden one afternoon, waiting for his horse to be brought round that he might set out on his visits for the day. As the place was Islington, and the month June, and the year 1718, we conceived the surroundings as being countrified and pleasant. To him entered his confidential servant, Luke Jennett, who had been with him 20 years. I said I wished to speak with him, and what I had to say might take some 1/4 of an hour. He accordingly bade me go into his study, which was a room opening on the terrace path where he was walking, and came in himself and sat down. I told him that, much against my will, I must look out for another place. He inquired what was my reason in consideration I had been so long with him. I said if he would excuse me, he would do me a great kindness, because this appears to have been common form even in 1718. I was one that always liked to have everything pleasant about me. As well as I can remember, he said that was his case likewise, but he would wish to know why I should change my mind after so many years, and, says he, you know there can be no talk of a remembrance of you in my will if you leave my service now. I said I had made my reckoning of that. Then, says he, you must have some complaint to make, and if I could I would willingly set it right, and at that I told him, not seeing how I could keep it back, the matter of my former affidavit and of the bedstaff in the dispensing room, and said that a house where such things happened was no place for me. At which he, looking very dark upon me, said no more, but called me a fool, and said he would pay what was owing me in the morning, and so, his horse being waiting, went out. So for that night I lodged with my sister's husband near Battlebridge, and came early next morning to my late master, who then made a great matter that I had not lain in his houses, and stopped a crown out of my wages owing. After that, I took service here and there, not for long at a time, and saw no more of him till I came to be Dr. Quin's man at Dodd's Hall in Islington. Islington? I think it's Islington. There is one obscure part in this statement, namely, the reference to the former affidavit and the matter of the bedstaff. The former affidavit is not in the bundle of papers. It is to be feared that it was taken out to be read because of its special oddity and not put back. Of what nature the story was may be guessed later, but as yet no clue has been put into our hands. The rector of Islington, Jonathan Pratt, is the next to step forward. He furnishes particulars of the standing and reputation of Dr. Abel and Dr. Quin, both of whom lived and practiced in his parish.
It is not to be supposed, he says, that a physician should be a regular attendant at morning and evening prayers, or at the Wednesday lectures, but within the measure of their ability I would say that both these persons fulfilled their obligations as loyal members of the Church of England. At the same time, as you desire my private mind, I must say, in the language of the schools, distinguo. Dr. A was to me a source of perplexity. Dr. Q, to my eye, a plain, honest believer, not inquiring over closely into points of belief, but squaring his practice to what lights he had. The other interested himself in questions to which Providence, as I hold, designs no answer to be given to us in this state. He would ask me, for example, what place I believed those beings now to hold in the scheme of creation, which by some are thought neither to have stood fast when the rebel angels fell, nor to have joined with them to the full pitch of their transgressions. As was suitable, my first answer to him was a question, what warrant he had for supposing any beings to exist? For that there was none in the Scripture, I took it he was aware. It appeared, for as I am on the subject, the whole tale may be given, that he grounded himself on such passages as that of the satyr which Jerome tells us conversed with Antony, but thought too that some parts of Scriptures might be cited in support. And besides, said he, you know 'tis the universal belief among those that spend their days and nights abroad, and I would add that if your calling took you so continuously as it does me about the country lanes by night, you might not be so surprised as I see you to be by my suggestion. You are then of John Milton's mind, I said, and hold that millions of spiritual creatures walk the earth unseen both when we wake and when we sleep. I do not know, he said, why Milton should take upon himself to say unseen, though, to be sure, he was blind when he wrote that, but for the rest, why, yes, I think he was in the right. Well, I said, though not so often as you, I am not seldom called abroad pretty late, but I have no mind of meeting a satyr in our Islington lanes in all the years I've been here. And if you have had the better luck, I am sure the Royal Society would be glad to know of it. I am reminded of these trifling expressions because Dr. A took them so ill, stamping out of the room in a huff, with some such word that these high and dry parsons had no eyes but for a prayer book or a pint of wine. But this was not the only time that our conversation took a remarkable turn. There was an evening when he came in, at first seeming gay and in good spirits, but afterwards, as he sat and smoked by the fire, falling into a musing way out of which to rouse him, I said pleasantly that I supposed he had had no meetings of late with his odd friends, a question which did effectually arouse him, for he looked most wildly and as if scared upon me, and said, "You were never there? I did not see you. Who brought you?" And then in a more collected tone, "What was this about a meeting? I believe I must have been in a doze." To which I answered that I was thinking of fauns and centaurs in the dark lane, and not of a witch's sabbath, but it seemed he took it differently. "Well," said he, "I can plead guilty to neither, but I find you very much more of a skeptic than becomes your cloth. If you care to know about the dark lane, you might do worse than ask my housekeeper that lived at the other end of it when she was a child." "Yes," said I, "and the old women in the almshouse and the children in the kennel. If I were you, I would send to your brother Quin for a bolus to clear your brain." Damn Quinn, says he. Talk no more of him. He's embezzled 4 of my best patients this month. I believe it is that cursed man of his, Janet, that used to be with me. His tongue is never still. It should be nailed to the pillory if he had his deserts. This, I may say, was the only time of his showing me that he had any grudge against either Dr. Quinn or Janet, and as was my business, I did my best to persuade him he was mistaken in them. Yet it could not be denied that some respectable families in the parish had given him the cold shoulder, and for no reason that they were willing to allege. The end was that he said he had not done so ill at Islington, but that he could afford to live at ease elsewhere when he chose, and anyhow he bore Dr. Quinn no malice. I think I now remember what observation of mine drew him into the train of thought which he next pursued. It was, I believe, my mentioning some juggling tricks which my brother in the East Indies had seen at the court of the Rajah of Mysore. A convenient thing enough, said Dr. Abel to me, if by some arrangement a man could get the power of communicating motion and energy to inanimate objects. As if the axe should move itself against him that lifts it, something of that kind. Well, I don't know that was in my mind so much, but if you could summon such a volume from your shelf, or even order it to open to the right page. He was sitting by the fire. It was a cold evening, and stretched out his hand that way, and just then the fire-irons, or at least one poker, fell over towards him with a great clatter, and I did not hear what else he said. But I told him that I could not easily conceive of an arrangement, as he called it, of such a kind that would not include as one of its conditions a heavier payment than any Christian should care to make, to which he assented. But, he said, I have no doubt that these bargains can be made very tempting, very persuasive. Still, you would not favor them, eh, doctor? No, I suppose not. This is as much as I know of Dr. Abel's mind and the feeling between these men. Dr. Quinn, as I said, was a plain, honest creature, and a man to whom I would have gone, indeed, I have before now gone to him for advice on matters of business. He was, however, every now and again, and particularly of late, not exempt from troublesome fancies. There was certainly a time when he was so much harassed by his dreams that he could not keep them to himself, but would tell them to his acquaintances, and among them to me. I was at supper at his house, and he was not inclined to let me leave him at my usual time. If you go, he said, there will be nothing for it, but I must go to bed and dream of the chrysalis. You might be worse off, said I. I do not think it, he said, and he shook himself like a man who is displeased with the complexion of his thoughts. I only meant, said I, that a chrysalis is an innocent thing. This one is not, he said, and I do not care to think of it. However, sooner than lose my company, he was fain to tell me, for I pressed him, that this was a dream which had come to him several times of late, and even more than once in a night. It was to this effect, that he seemed to himself to wake under an extreme compulsion to rise and go out of doors. By the door there stood a spade which he must take, and go out into the garden, and at a particular place in the shrubbery, somewhat clear, and upon which the moon shone, for there was always in his dream a full moon, he would feel himself forced to dig. And after some time the spade would uncover something light-colored, which he would perceive to be a stuff, linen or woolen, and this he must clear with his hands. It was always the same, of the size of a man, and shaped like the chrysalis of a moth, with the folds showing the promise of an opening at one end. He could not describe how gladly he would have left all of this stage and run to the house, but he must not escape so easily, so with many groans, and knowing only too well what to expect, he parted these folds of stuff, or as it sometimes seemed to be, a membrane, and disclosed a head covered with a smooth pink skin, which, breaking as the creature stirred, showed him his own face in a state of death. The telling of this so much disturbed him that I was forced, out of mere compassion, to sit with him the greater part of the night and talk with him upon indifferent subjects. He said that upon every recurrence of this dream he woke and found himself, as it were, fighting for his breath. Another extract from Luke Jennet's long, continuous statement comes in at this point. I never told tales of my master, Dr. Abel, to anybody in the neighborhood. When I was in another service, I remember to have spoken to my fellow servants about the matter of the bedstaff, but I am sure I never said either I or he were the persons concerned,
and it met with so little credit that I was affronted and thought best to keep it to myself. And when I came back to Islington and found Dr. Abel still there, who I was told had left the parish, I was clear that it was behoved me to use great discretion, for indeed I was afraid of the man, and it is certain I was no party to spreading any ill report of him. My master, Dr. Quinn, was a very just, honest man, and no maker of mischief. I'm sure he never stirred a finger nor said a word by way of inducement to a soul that would to make them leave going to Dr. Abel and come to him. Nay, he would hardly be persuaded to attend them that came, until he was convinced that if he did not, they would send into the town for a physician rather than do as they had hitherto done. I believe it may be proved that Dr. Abel came into my master's house more than once. We had a new chambermaid out of Hertfordshire, and she asked me who was the gentleman that was looking after the master, that is Dr. Quinn, when he was out, and seemed so disappointed that he was out. She said whoever he was, he knew the way of the house well, running at once into the study and then into the dispensing room and last into the bedchamber. I made her tell me what he was like, and what she said was suitable enough to Dr. Abel, but besides, she told me she saw the same man at church, and someone told her that was the doctor. It was just after this that my master began to have his bad nights and complained to me and other persons, and in particular what discomfort he suffered from his pillow and bedclothes. He said he must buy some to suit him and should do his own marketing, and accordingly brought home a parcel which he said was of the right quality, but where he bought it we had then no knowledge, only that they were marked in thread with a coronet and a bird. The women said they were of a sort not commonly met with, and very fine, and my master said they were both the comfortablest he ever used, and he slept now both soft and deep. Also, the feathered pillows were the best sorted, and his head would sink into them as if they were a cloud, which I have myself remarked several times when I came to wake him of a morning, his face being almost hid by the pillow closing over it. I had never any communication with Dr. Abel after I came back to Islington, but one day when he passed me in the street and asked me whether I was not looking for another service, to which I answered I was very well suited where I was, but he said I was a tickle-minded fellow, and he doubted not he should soon hear I was on the world again, which indeed proved true. Dr. Pratt is next taken up where he left off. On the 16th I was called up out of my bed soon after it was light, that is, about 5, with a message that Dr. Quinn was dead or dying. Making my way to his house, I found there was no doubt which was the truth. All the persons in the house, except the one that let me in, were already in his chamber and standing about his bed, but none touching him. He was stretched in the midst of the bed on his back without any disorder, and indeed had the appearance of one ready laid out for burial. His hands, I think, were even crossed on his breast. The only thing not usual was that nothing was to be seen of his face, the two ends of the pillow or bolster appearing to be quite closed over it. These I immediately pulled apart, at the same time rebuking those present, and especially the man, for not at once coming to the assistance of his master. He, however, only looked at me and shook his head, having evidently no more hope than myself that there was anything but a corpse before us. Indeed, it was plain to anyone possessed of the least experience that he was not only dead, but had died of suffocation. Nor could it be conceived that his death was accidentally caused by the mere folding of the pillow over his face. How should he not, feeling the oppression, have lifted his hands to put it away, whereas not a fold of the sheet which was closely gathered about him, as I now observed, was disordered? The next thing was to procure a physician. I had bethought me of this on leaving my house, and sent on the messenger who had come to me to Dr. Abel, but I now heard that he was away from home, and the nearest surgeon was got, who, however, could tell no more, at least without opening the body, than we already knew. As to any person entering the room with evil purpose, which was the next point to be cleared, it was visible that the bolts of the door were burst from their stanchions, and the stanchions broken away from the doorpost by main force, and there was a sufficient body of witness, the smith among them, to testify that this had been done but a few minutes before I came. The chamber being moreover at the top of the house, the window was neither easy of access, nor did it show any sign of an exit made that way, either by marks upon the sill or footprints below upon soft mould. The surgeon's evidence forms, of course, part of the report of the inquest, but since it has nothing but remarks upon the healthy state of the larger organs and the coagulation of blood in various parts of the body, it need not be reproduced. The verdict was death by the visitation of God. Annexed to the other papers is one which I was at first inclined to suppose had made its way among them by mistake. Upon further consideration, I think I can divine a reason for its presence. It relates to the rifling of a mausoleum in Middlesex, which stood in a park now broken up, the property of a noble family which I will not name. The outrage was not that of an ordinary resurrection man. The object, it seemed likely, was theft. The account is blunt and terrible. I shall not quote it. A dealer in North London suffered heavy penalties as a receiver of stolen goods in connection with the affair. And I guess that's the end. Yeah, I guess that's the end. So, I guess that is the end of A Thin Ghost and Others by M.R. James. Sort of a sudden end. Which means next Sunday we'll be starting a new book from Project Gutenberg. If you have ideas for that, go ahead and hit me up on Twitter. Otherwise, join me on Thursday for more video game streams, and I will hope to see you later in the week. You have a good night and a good rest of your weekend. Goodbye.